Okay, so did everybody here get the notes? I hope if you ever don't get them, let me know, because that means I screwed up somehow. Oh, you're back. Okay, good. So wanting to just check in and see if anybody has any remaining questions from what we were talking about previously. If not, I want to move on and talk a little bit about the fall of Rome, because this is gonna kind of put a bookend to this early period of the development of the church, and then we'll start looking at
Jim had his hand up.
Yeah, good. Okay. Who did?
Well,
Jim.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, you're good.
I just wanted to mention that that you mentioned last week that Julian was one of your favorite emperors.
Yes.
So that prompted me to start reading Gore Vidal's bestseller titled Julian.
Okay.
Which is a novel based on Julian's. Although Vidal says he kept pretty close to the facts, and apparently Julian's life was well documented.
Yes.
More than most. But it's an enjoyable read. I haven't finished it, but it's an enjoyable read, and I'm glad that you gave us the background on Mithraism and the tension between Christianity and Hellenism. You know.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he calls the Christians Galileans. He doesn't use the term.
Mm-hmm. That was one word by which they were known, although as you know, that's a cultural reference that meant something different in Rome than it did in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because what the Palestinian community thought the Galileans were is different from who the Romans thought the Galilean was. But yeah. Cool. Well, I don't think I've ever read that, so I'll have to get that. Thank you for
good.
Anna.
I just wanted to, did you send the notes to Sarah Ann?
Yeah,
I just did.
And okay, I forwarded them just to make sure you got them.
Oh, okay. All right. Oh, now you got them twice. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna make sure. All right. So I just want you to think for a second. Anybody else before we move on have something you wanted to share? That's great. When you find a source like that, like Jim did, let us all know, because it may or may not be something I've been exposed to or that other people would enjoy. So if you think about the state of Christianity in our day and age in the US right now, and you think about, Jerry Falwell Jr., and you think about the Catholic Church and Pope Benedict, and you think about all the things that are going on, the rise of the none, no religious preference group. Try to imagine talking about any of that or explaining any of that without referring to the political situation. It's really hard to understand what's happening with the church in any century without having a pretty good understanding of what's going on in society and in government, because there's always that interaction between the church and the government. So the Roman era and what happens after Rome, that's also true. And so we're spending a certain amount of time wrapping our minds around what's happening in society, what's happening in the empire, in order to be able to have a sense of what's happening in the church itself. So we've talked before about what made it so difficult for the Roman Empire at its height to stay integrated, to stay in one piece. Because when you're going from Britain on the one end to Persia on the other end, basically, and what you have is the transportation of basically human feet, or at best horses. It's really hard. It becomes very unwieldy to administer that whole area. And so one effort to overcome that challenge was the idea of, well, let's break it up into sections. So the Emperor Diocletian in 286, so sort of just before Constantine and the whole acceptance of Christianity, he's the one that says, let's divide this up into two segments. We'll have the Western half and the Eastern half. And the church had kind of done that in a 5-part division, right? Starting with Alexandria in North Africa, and then over to Jerusalem, and then to Antioch, and then to Rome, and eventually then to Constantinople when Constantine gets around to starting it. So, so even the church recognized, we can't have just one overall authority, because there's no way to stay in touch. There's no way to make this a unified thing. And then Constantine comes along and, oh, okay. Hopefully that's not something to do anything about. Okay. Constantine comes along and says, okay, we're going to tolerate Christianity, and then we're going to endorse Christianity. We're going to co-opt Christianity, in a sense, to be the uniting principle here. And therefore, we need a new capital city. That was part of the reason. Now, this is a guy who named everything after himself. I mean, he was kind of the original Trump, right? All his kids have names that they're Constantitia or Constantinus, or, I mean, they all sound like his name. And so when he decides to have a new city that he's going to build, of course, he's going to name it after himself. So that's Constantinople. And that really, he starts thinking about this in about 320, but it really gets underway in 324. And he's doing this for lots of reasons, mostly ego, but partly also because he wants to build a city where the Christian churches do not have to compete with the established temples to the Roman gods. It's sort of like, if I want to start a new department store, I might build my own shopping mall that's not already anchored by Sears and Penny's, right? Because I'm going to have trouble creating the loyalty to my new brand if I've got to compete with these things that people already know, that have already been there. If I'm the only department store in town, then I've got a certain monopoly, right, on the competition. So part of the virtue of Constantinople is that there are no existing pagan temples, and so Constantine can build his churches and not have to figure out how to make them more attractive or engaging than the existing pagan temples. Part of the unintended consequence of this move of the capital city, so if the emperor goes, the Praetorian Guard goes, all of the accessories of government kind of go with him. And so this left Rome vulnerable. It left the city of Rome, it withdrew economic support from Rome, and it withdrew military support from Rome. So as outsiders begin to look at the vulnerabilities of the Roman Empire, they begin to say, can we pick off some of these cities that have resources, that have riches, that have access, that have things that we as newcomers are looking for. Rome begins to look like an easier target than Constantinople, because it's sort of sitting out there by itself. And if you think about that curve that we've talked about, Constantinople's kind of over nearer to the middle of the curve. Rome's really hanging out here in the West, kind of by itself. And so it becomes a target in a way that some of the more eastern major cities are less. It's not that they're not targets from time to time, but it's just less easy to get into them. And the other reason for the choice of Byzantium, what was the city of Byzantium that Constantine makes into Constantinople, is that it's very defensible militarily. It's very easily supplied by sea, so it's hard to lay siege to it. It's hard to attack because of the way the ground lies. And so he was not only thinking about religion when he picked that spot, he was also thinking about making it very costly for anyone to bring up a military force. It was not that hard in Rome, where the city of Rome was located, as we shall see. Does that all make sense? Okay, so the Roman Empire, the infrastructure, the administration is starting to crumble, and it sounds a little unnervingly familiar to me when I look at our society in the present day. But some of the things that were going on were specifically tax avoidance by the rich. So in the day, you know, really, yeah, right. But it's interesting because at the height of the Roman Empire, and in the days of when the Republic had kind of transformed into more of an empire, you know, more of a one ruler kind of thing, there was still this concept that people who were wealthy had the responsibility and the honor of supporting civic, excuse me, I don't know. This is, that's not going anywhere. Okay. Of supporting the government and supporting the social infrastructure. So if you were known to be wealthy, then there was an expectation that you were going to be a benefactor to the government and to the city, to wherever you lived. So, you know, if your town needed fresh water and you were the big man on campus, you know, if you were the leading family, then everyone knew that it was your job to put in an aqueduct. And once you did that, you got a lot of acclaim. You got to write your name on it and, you know, be celebrated for doing that. Or if you wanted to sort of raise your profile in the social structure, if you wanted to maybe campaign to be named a senator, or you wanted your son to be made a general, or, you know, you wanted your daughter to marry up in the social ladder, you maybe sponsored the festival of the parade of the emperor's statue that year. You know, you funded things that the city needed to do. So it was not about either the Senate or the government in some sense, or the emperor, as there came to be emperors, trying to fund these things out of their own pockets. It was basically peer pressure. It was social pressure on the people that had the money. Now, you know, I mean, that's a little different from saying, here's your bill from the IRS, you know, pay up. But there was this concept that you weren't really wealthy, you weren't really prestigious if you weren't doing these things, because you weren't carrying your weight, right? You were not, you were nouveau riche, you know, even if you had money, if you weren't doing the things that gained you honor in society, then what was the point? You know, I mean, you just had money, but so what? you had no honor, you had no civic pride, right? So as the empire crumbles, there's less advantage to that kind of social prestige. There's less, that kind of honor is less important, and people are less willing to part with their own family money to fund those kinds of things. And so that meant that then the government, which basically had, their job had been to fund the army. The government paid for the army, and citizens paid for a lot of the infrastructure things. So now the government has competition for being able to fund the army. There's other things that they have to pay for too, or they're not going to happen. And also, once upon a time, if you wanted to have influence, you needed to be on site. You needed to be in Rome. And as being in Rome becomes less important, some of the richer families begin to move to the outskirts. They move out into what we would call the suburbs. They move into little towns of their own, basically, where they can say, hey, I'm responsible for, you know, this little town. I can't be buying all this stuff for Rome. And so there's a real shift in the way the economy of government works within the empire. There's also what historians call an over-reliance on slaves. I mean, some of us would say that any reliance on slaves is an over-reliance on slaves, but there was a period of sustainability when, and remember that slavery in Rome is not hereditary. It's not even necessarily permanent. So the fact that you are born to slaves doesn't necessarily make you a slave. Now you can sell your children into slavery if you have a mind to do that. You can sell yourself into slavery. And obviously, if you're born to a slave, you're probably not born into a lot of resources. So you may not get much of an education. You may not get fed a whole lot. I mean, it's not a good thing to be born to a slave, but it doesn't make you a slave, and it certainly doesn't make you a slave for life. Slaves have rights. They can own money, which means that they can save up and buy their freedom. And once they do, they're indistinguishable from anybody else. You know, it's not a racial thing at all. And lots of people do that. So there's this kind of constant turnover of people who didn't used to be slaves become slaves, and people who used to be slaves get out of slavery. And there's this constant influx of captives from the wars. So as the military goes out to conquer more territory, one of the things that they do is to enslave the indigenous populations that they come across, particularly the women and children. You know, so you'll hear a lot about, well, they killed all the men, but then they took the women and children captives. So, the army only needs a few slaves. You know, they can't haul the whole community that they just conquered around with them. So what do? They send them back to Rome. And so Rome has this constant influx of new slaves, many of whom will not necessarily die slaves, you know, many of whom will work their way out of slavery, and some of them won't, and some of them will die quickly because they've been, you know, injured or removed from their families or whatever. It's not a good thing. But as the military becomes less and less successful, as it's less and less easy for it to go out and capture new territory and enslave new people, the more they have to go out and defend the borders that already exist, the less opportunity there is to bring a new influx of enslaved people into the capital or into their estates, these major estates. So the the expectation that there will always be slaves to do both manual labor and crafts becomes less and less something you can count on. And so some of that work goes undone. And this is, by the way, some of you will remember we talked about the gospel where supposedly there's a tax, and so the governor requires everyone to go back to the city of their birth, and that's how Jesus comes to be born in Bethlehem, even though he grows up in Nazareth, right? Everybody remember that? There is no historical record to suggest that that ever happened in Palestine, but it happened a number of times in Rome, because what would happen is that the slaves and the peasants from the countryside would come into the city because they thought their financial prospects would be better, which they were. So no one was working the land. So there were several times when the Roman administrator said, okay, this is it. As of this date, everybody has to go back to where they were born. You know, if you were born out in the countryside, you go back there, and we're going to go count and see that. And the idea was you're supposed to stay there. We don't need you cluttering up the city. We need you working the land. So we think that's where that sort of historical explanation arises, because that was an issue in Roman culture, and it came out of that the sort of drying up of the supply of new slaves. The other thing that happened is that Rome became very dependent on North Africa for their crops, for their produce, particularly wheat. And so they were importing huge amounts of grain across the Mediterranean, which was fine as long as they were in control of the Mediterranean. But as their military abilities began to decline, one of the first things that happened was the rise of piracy on the Mediterranean. And so you would have these North African ships and Viking ships and, you know, various different other groups who would be capturing. Hey, Margaret, how are you? They would be taking over the ships that were bound for Rome, and basically, you know, kidnapping them, hijacking them, and taking their contents to other places, which both deprived Rome of food it needed and also wreaked economic havoc, because you could no longer depend on the idea that you sent your crop to Rome and then you got paid for it, and that was how you made your living. So all of those, tax avoidance and dwindling supply of slaves and the rise of piracy on the Mediterranean, all threw monkey wrenches into what had been a relatively sustainable economic system for Rome, and were part of what hastened its demise. Does that all make sense? Okay. Then there were the military issues. So we've talked about the fact that the empire was overextended. It was really hard to get troops as far away as you needed them. It was hard to get, you know, if one general got killed, you know, who's going to decide who the next general is, and how are you going to get them where you need them to be? It was hard to get messages back and forth. You know, if someone writes back to Central Command, what am I supposed to do? It might take weeks or months to hear the answer to that, and by then things have changed. So it's really hard to administer an army as well as an empire that way. It began to be less of a path to influence and power within the Roman administration to come up through the army. That was no guarantee that you could wind up in the Senate or, get anything great out of that unless you kind of started pretty high up in the ranks to begin with. And so it became harder and harder to recruit infantry, people to just be foot soldiers in the army. And so what the army started to do, what the generals started to do, is that they would hire local mercenaries. And there were a couple advantages to that. I mean, one is that if the Romans came into a place that they were trying to conquer, or that they had once conquered and was now trying to revolt and get free, there was always some other tribe or some other group that wanted that territory. I mean, there was almost no undisputed territory. So the Romans could always hire whoever it was that had their eye on that territory to fight with them to take it over, because that's what those guys would have been doing anyway, Romans or no Romans. And the Romans actually paid them, and the Romans fed them, and so it was a good deal to work for the Romans. Moreover, the one thing that the Romans had that nobody else had was citizenship. And so when the Romans came in and said, okay, you guys want to occupy this territory, we will help you do that if a certain number of your, qualified people will join our military forces. And if we succeed, they will become Roman citizens. And that was something that there was no other way to get. Unless you had a huge amount of money, you couldn't buy it. You couldn't, there was no other way to attain it. So that was a very tantalizing promise that we will make you Roman citizens if we are victorious in this campaign. Well, of course, what that does is it means suddenly you have, instead of slaves to send back, you have a whole bunch more citizens, diluting the meaning of citizenship. And you have a bunch of citizens whose primary loyalty is not necessarily to Rome, whose ethnic and community origins are with the tribes that they came out of when you made them mercenaries. So they can go around saying that they're Roman citizens, but that doesn't mean they're loyal to the emperor. That doesn't mean that they understand Roman government or that they have the same sense of ambition to extend Roman control over the hinterlands, so to speak. So you have a lot of these sort of quasi citizens, and of course, one general can say, okay, you guys come fight with us, and when we're done, we will give you this territory and we'll make you Roman citizens, and we'll give you, such and such allotment of food, or we'll pay you so and so much money. Well, if that general gets killed in the next battle, and the next general comes in and says, well, I didn't promise you any of that, this makes for very touchy relationships then with those troops. I mean, who are they loyal to at that point if they feel like they've been tricked by one Roman, and here's another Roman trying to promise me something else, and I don't know whether I buy any of this. So when you get to the place where that's the majority of your fighting force, is people you kind of have to bribe to fight for you, rather than troops who have an inherent identification and loyalty with the Roman cause, that's a very different military situation. You can no longer trust the military in the same way that you were able to before. And then finally, the thing that begins to get really scary at the end of the 4th century, in the beginning of the 5th, in the early 400s, is the need to defend Rome itself. And back in the day, the frontiers were in Spain, the frontiers were in Britain, the frontiers were off in the Balkans. You know, if you lived in Rome, you didn't have to worry about any of that. And so there was this sense of Rome itself as invulnerable, you know, Rome, the eternal city, kind of. And the first time Rome gets sacked in 410, the first time that the barbarian troops actually get as far as Rome itself and use physical military force to invade the city. I mean, it's not just, yeah, well, we lost some statues and maybe some houses got burned and, you know, it was bad, you know, we didn't like it. But there was this sense of invulnerability that disappeared. I think of it a little like 9/11, you know, that suddenly it happened here. You know, I mean, terrorism is not just a thing that goes on over there. It's like, it can happen to us. And what that means is now Rome has to invest money and military skill in defending the city itself. And that didn't used to be the case. Used to be you could send your best generals out to the borderlands to take care of that. But now you got to have somebody in town who's going to run the thing if the city itself gets attacked. So that was another military change that made it more challenging. Is all that kind of making sense about where the society is going? There's all, go ahead. Yeah, Kay.
I ask, was their military just getting worse, or were other places military getting better? I guess I'm wondering how it deteriorated.
Right. I don't, well, a couple things I want to say about that. Let me see if I can spit them out in order. There is one particular technological advance, which is that the Huns, that these folks up in the steppes of Russia and Mongolia, will figure out first the saddle and secondly the stirrup. Romans didn't have those. And so the technology of fighting on horseback is something that the barbarians are going to have before the Romans have it. They had chariots. Mostly they did their horse fighting from chariots. And this is true with the Egyptians too, that you have a guy driving a chariot and then you have a guy riding in the chariot with him with a bow and arrow that can shoot, or with a spear that can stab or whatever. But if you don't have the saddle and you don't have stirrups, it's very hard either to fire a bow or to use a spear or a sword from horseback, because most of your attention is staying on the horse at that point. So they do get challenged by that technological innovation. Other than that, I don't think their technology got worse, but the sense of what it meant to be a Roman soldier in terms of your identification with that role, what did that mean? I mean, there was a time when the Roman soldiers were, you know, they took pride in their uniformity. They took pride in their, you know, the way they looked out for each other. There was a sense of, you know, that old, it's sweet and fitting to die for your country. You know, that sort of, like being a Roman soldier was like the highest honor in a certain way that you could aspire to. So the training was also uniform. There was a sense of, we all do this the same way. When you start diluting that with all of these mercenaries who learn to fight in whatever the tradition of their particular culture was, and, you know, maybe you get 6 weeks to try to integrate them into the Roman troops or whatever, but they're never going to have that same identity with the method of the Roman military. So I do think that dilution is a deficit, you know, in the skill and the power of those troops. The other thing that's going to happen, and this kind of gets us into the next section, is the emperorship itself becomes a very tenuous kind of thing. I think that's in the 75 years from the end of the 300s to the middle 400s or something. I forget exactly what the years are, but there's a series of 75 years when there are 20 different emperors. And mostly that's because they get assassinated. You know, they kill each other off, or they die in battle, or a handful of them die of natural causes, but after only a year or two of running things. So you get very little continuity in foreign policy or in military strategy or in anything else, because, you know, no sooner is the one guy in than somebody else comes along and says, no, we're not going to do that anymore. One of the most frequent ways of becoming emperor at this point is as the Senate, the Roman Senate, becomes more corrupt and less powerful. Who is going to be the next emperor is less either hereditary or elective. It's more military. You know, who the guy who is closest to Rome with the most troops is the one who is most likely to become the next emperor. And so what happens is, when you learn that the last emperor has died, which, you know, if you're far enough away, might be quite a while, if your troops like you, then what they can do is acclaim you emperor. Those are the first people who will say, oh, look, you be the next emperor. Yay, okay. And then what do? You all march to Rome and say, here's the next emperor, it's our guy. And so that the fact that your general has one eye on the throne, the imperial throne, you know, he's half of his ambition is political rather than necessarily military. And part of that involves, how can I be doing my military thing and becoming a hero and making myself popular with my troops, and also not be that far from Rome, so I can get there, you know, faster than anybody else. And that kind of puts a kink in how committed you are to a particular campaign in the sense of the army, because you want to be able to hightail it back to the city if things change. So this is not a particularly intelligent way of choosing your executive, right? Now, it is true that at this point, the central administration is sufficiently chaotic that if you as a general can keep your troops alive and fed and, you know, all marching in the same direction, you have to have some administrative ability. I mean, it's not a completely irrational way of doing things, but it does not necessarily elevate the person who has the greatest diplomatic skill or the most commitment to the long-term vision of what Rome is supposed to be, right? It's the person who can get his soldiers to support him and get into town and, you know, make a deal with whatever corrupt senator they can get their hands on and sort of manipulate the process. And so that too, I think, is not helpful to the actual function of the military. So in those ways, I think their capacity gets diminished. Does that help, Kay? Okay, all right. Now, a piece of this does have to do with Christianity, in the sense that that old tradition of civic responsibility and support is not, it doesn't work if you're Christian. You know, you're wanting to be honored and remembered as the person who built the amphitheater, or as the person who built the baths, you know, for your city. You know, if what you're really looking forward to is Jesus coming back and, you know, being raised into a new spiritual being, you don't care anymore about having your name on Trump Tower, right? And it's the motivation just completely goes out of that. And I think if you understand that, you understand why there were that century of people saying the Christians are bad for society. You know, the Christians are bad for the political integrity of Rome, because they take people out of this pool of those who want to invest in the infrastructure of society, right? And the way they expressed that was, they said they're not honoring the gods, right? They're not building the temples, they're not sponsoring the festivals, they're not doing any of the things that create political cohesion. And that was right, that was true. And so I think you do have to see the rise of Christianity as part of what creates the sand in the gears of how this whole system has always worked. So does that make sense? Any questions or observations or whatever about that? Okay. So then I thought we would look a little bit about the barbarian tribes, because that's the thing that's going to kind of finish off Roman pretension to running Europe. And is that a question? No, okay. So this is one place, one of the few places that I know of, and I am no expert on East Asian history at all, but where the history of China actually impacts the history of Europe. Because what happens in the 3rd century around then is that China starts to get its act together, and China expands its borders. And when China expands its borders to the west, it pushes the tribal peoples that were constantly invading China, it pushes them to the west. As China secures its borders against those invasions, then those tribal people, these are the ones who are a horse culture, who invent the saddle and invent the stirrup, that they no longer have the option of raiding to their east. They have to go to their west now, because China's got troops, China's got a wall, China's a more to contend with than to the west. So those Huns are going to push the Germanic tribes who are west of them to their west, and also to their south. And so what's going to happen to Rome is not so much that Rome itself is invaded by the Huns. That's not what happens. But the Huns push the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, to their west. And as they go to their west, they encounter Rome. They encounter European Rome. And between the Huns, who are nomadic and uncivilized, And the Romans, who are very urban, even when their armies are marching around in the wilderness, their ideals are urban. They're looking for settled, built cities. That's what they like, right? Attila doesn't care about settled, built cities. You know, if anybody here watch Game of Thrones, the Dothraki are modeled after the Huns. Basically, it's that very mobile kind of animal-centered culture. And so as the tribes that are sort of in between the Huns to the east, the Romans to the south, they get squeezed. And so they begin to say, given our choices, we like the Romans better. We like to be more like the Romans. That looks good to us. Meanwhile, the Romans are saying, we need mercenaries. We need people to help us defend our borders, right? So this is kind of like a match made in heaven, because the Romans are offering you food and support and territory and possibly even citizenship if you will help them defend their borders. And you need to get out of the way of these encroaching people from the east anyway. And so to call it a barbarian invasion is to take a very Roman-centric view of what's going on here. It's really migration. It's really cultural integration, kind of, that these tribal peoples are aspiring to what Rome is showing them is possible. So they want to get a piece of that. And, you know, so a piece of it might just be territory. A piece of it might be culture, literacy, or a piece of it might just be wealth. And a piece of it might be participation in the authority, participation in the administrative power of Rome as well. So you have the first quote unquote invasion, which was not of Rome, but of Roman territory in 251. So that's, you can kind of, that 250 is the date when you can say the Roman Empire is no longer secure. Okay, that it's no longer a done deal to say you're a Roman citizen and everybody leaves you alone. Because what happens in that invasion is that the Goths take a bunch of captives. And I mean, fair enough, this is what the Romans always do, right? It's what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And primarily they take women and children, and some of the women just wind up as sort of captured wives. A lot of the men wind up as slaves. But the thing is, a lot of those who are taken captive are Christian. This is not necessarily something that the Goths are familiar with at that point, but they're about to become familiar with it, because those people are going to be integrated now into their society. That's going to be your wife, or maybe just the mother of your child. It's going to be the cook that fixes your dinner. It's going to be, you know, there's going to be a very intimate connection with some of these captive peoples. And so Christianity is going to start becoming familiar. Not necessarily that all the leaders of the community are going to say, boom, let's all be Christian, but it's going to start percolating in its own way in these tribal societies. So, you know, the Christianity that came from Jerusalem to Rome got translated by Rome. And now the Christianity that's coming from Rome into the pagan tribal peoples is going to be retranslated into their idiom. You know, they're going to do with Christianity what they're going to do with Christianity, which may or may not be what the Bishop of Antioch thinks they ought to be doing with Christianity. And for one thing, they're going to be Arians with the I. They're going to be non-Trinitarians to start out with, all of the pagan tribal peoples, the Goths and so on. So a little less than 100 years later, and this rating goes on back and forth repetitively. 251 is just sort of the first big one that we can identify. Yes, Anna.
Aryans, for the most part, because of the location that they took the captives from, because of that region.
Right, because that's what the captives were.
Okay.
The captives were Arian, so that's what they're teaching.
Okay.
So then you get Wolfilist, I guess is how you say it. Sometimes in Roman you'll see it Ulfilus without the W, but his name means little wolf in Germanic, so I think Wolfilist works. He becomes a bishop in the Christian church. In fact, he's ordained by Eusebius of Nicomedia. Does anybody remember Eusebius of Nicomedia? Where did we see him before? All right, I'll tell you. Remember Constantine at the end of his life sets out for the Holy Land because he wants to be baptized in the River Jordan, and he doesn't get that far because he dies first. Eusebius of Nicomedia is the bishop who baptized Constantine on his deathbed. So there are these connections. You know, it's a small world at that point. People encounter each other and know each other. But Wolfilus is the person who, according to legend, and there's some historical suggestion that this is probably right, creates an alphabet, a written alphabet for the language that the Goths are speaking at that time, and then translates at least the Gospels, but we think the whole Bible, into that language and writes it down in that language in the alphabet that he creates. And for his trouble, he gets kicked out of the territory that he originally was missionizing, where he was trying to create more Christians. The political and military powers that be within that community finally say, you know, this Christianity thing is just too bizarre and we don't understand what this written language is, and you're out. So he takes his followers, the church or the group of people that he has missionized, and he moves south. He moves into what is now Bulgaria, and has his Christian community there, and becomes a fixture in Roman political awareness in Roman society. So he's sort of known traditionally as the missionary to the Goths. But he creates a model that this is what we need to do if we're going to bring these people into our culture. You know, if we're going to offer them citizenship, if we're going to try to persuade them to fight on our side, right, then we need to evangelize them. We need to make Christians out of them, because at this point, that's what it means. And part of what it means to be a Roman is to be a Christian, right? So we've got to send people to teach them. And so this becomes sort of the second wave of evangelism, right? I mean, you had Paul and you had the churches that he founded and that then became kind of a mutual support group with each other, and the mission to Roman citizens, the mission to the empire, if you will. This becomes the second wave. Okay, now we're Christians. Now we have to go out to these other groups and evangelize them if they're going to be able to participate in our society the way that they aspire to and the way that we need them to. And you can see this if anybody has read Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Myths of Avalon. Have any feminists here? If not, oh, good. Yay, Bob. Thank you. That is a very interesting theory about the encounter between the tribal paganism of the British Isles and the Christianity of the Roman Empire in Britain. And it's very, it's entertaining. And but it sort of shows you both sides, why it was important and seemed like the right thing to the Romans to bring Christianity to the pagans, and what the pagans thought they had to lose and were right that they had to lose if they let that happen. So if you're interested in that encounter, that's a kind of fun way to get a sense of it. Okay, so in 376, it's important to remember that the Danube River has traditionally been, during the Roman Empire, one of the boundaries, one of the borders, because it was fairly easy for Roman troops on the southern end or side of the Danube to prevent any kind of massive crossing. You could send over a boat and the army could pick off those people pretty easily. And it was hard to have a mass migration that the army couldn't stop. But you have a really cold winter in 376, and the Danube freezes. It freezes solid. It freezes solid enough that not only can people cross it, hang on. Not only can people cross it, armies can cross it, livestock can cross it, armed people can cross it. And so there is everybody on the north side sort of says, hey, look, this is our opportunity. We've been confined, we've been constrained by the impossibility of getting across this river. And, the Roman troops have been kind of fighting an action for decades at this point of trying to hold that border, trying to keep those barbarians on the other side who are trying to migrate. They're trying to come into new territory because they're under pressure from the Eastern forces. And all of a sudden they have this opportunity and they kind of all take it en masse. Everybody who wants to cross can cross. They can cross in hidden places. They can cross in sufficient numbers that the Roman troops just don't have a chance of preventing it. So there's this, and it's not like a bunch of soldiers came and attacked. It's just everybody came, and the Roman troops were too thin on the ground to stop them. And they didn't necessarily want to do anything violent. They just wanted more territory. It's sort of like the westward migration in the US. If the Indians had all gotten together and held out, let's say at the Mississippi River, and then suddenly one winter, everything froze solid and all the European pioneers kind of just flooded over. That's kind of what it was like. So the Roman army, kind of where they could, they tried to make a virtue of necessity, and they tried to cut deals with these people and get those of them who were able for military service to kind of join them. Okay, now you're here, why don't you be in the army? And being in the army meant, first of all, you got fed. If nothing else, there were, you had an allotment of food. Also, the troops would promise the whole community that had come over, we'll give you a certain allotment of food annually or monthly or whatever, if those of you who can fight will fight. So it was not only that you got fed, but potentially your whole community got fed. And then the ultimate offer was, well, and if we're successful, in incorporating this territory into the empire in a sustainable way, then we might make you citizens. And so it was tempting for a lot of reasons, that not to, conquer the Roman soldiers and kill them, but to get on their good side, to be incorporated by them. That's what you kind of wanted. And that's all well and good if the Romans do what they said they were going to do. But guess what? Just like the American government dealing with the indigenous tribal people here, by and large, they didn't. They did not live up to the promises that they had made to those communities when they all came over. It was easier to get what you were promised if you were actually personally a soldier, but in a lot of cases, there weren't food donations, and they weren't necessarily allotted territory in the way that they thought they should be. And so by about 400, by about the turn of the century, there starts to be this sense of resentment. And initially it was, yay, we got across the river, yay, we have new territory, yay, we're in good with the Romans. But over the decades, people got disappointed, they got disillusioned. It's like, we're not getting the benefits of Roman culture and society out of this. We're not getting the things that the Romans promised us. We're still, half starved, half naked. We have not been incorporated in the way that we thought we would be. Just an interesting sidelight. One of the ways in which Romans and barbarians distinguished themselves with each other, I may have told you this before, was their cooking, right? Do you remember this? That the people who came from the north, from the herding cultures and the horse cultures, they cooked food with animal fat. They cooked with lard. The Romans, who came from the Mediterranean cultures, cooked with plant oil. They cooked with olive oil. And those two groups had very different food cultures. They also smelled different to each other. So there was kind of wasn't a racial distinction, but it was a very obvious kind of difficult to overcome cultural distinctions. So that was how they knew, if you cook in bear fat, you're a barbarian. If you cook in olive oil, you're a Roman. That was the way they figured that out. So at this point, there's now a sense that the Romans are not benefactors. They are, in fact, cheats. They renege on what they have promised us. And as long as the folks that were in the army felt like they were getting what they had been promised, that, you could manage that. But eventually, you start getting people who come up the ranks from among the mercenaries, and the ones who are really talented and skilled, they become leaders in the mercenary military forces. And not only do they get promised, food and coins or whatever, they get promised leadership positions. They get told, if you win this battle or this campaign, then we'll promote you up the ranks. Only if you're a barbarian, there's only so far up the ranks that the powers that be are going to let you go. You know, the authorities back in Rome are not going to promote people that they don't know from among these, you know, rubes, you know, and pagans. So you start to get not only resentful communities and resentful soldiers, but resentful generals. And that is a real problem, because one of the things that those resentful generals can do is lead their troops into other territories. Lead their all right, if you're not going to make good on the promises of food, then we'll just go seize it, you know, from the next town over. We'll just go take it. And in fact, when this guy, this Visigoth, who was known as King Alaric, he feels that the Roman authorities have not come through with what they promised to him and his people. And so he leads a bunch of primarily mercenary troops. Now, keep in mind that the Roman troops are not completely immune from revolt either. I mean, if they're out there freezing their fingers off and you know, trying to maintain these borders, and the people back in Rome are busy killing each other off and trying to figure out, you know, how they're going to pay for the next marble statue of Jupiter or whatever, that you don't have the sense as a foot soldier that you're being paid a lot of attention to. So eventually you may decide you have more in common with the other mercenary troops that you're serving with, and as much of a grievance against Rome as they do. So it doesn't have to be just the mercenary troops. It can also be the Roman troops who are feeling ill-used at that point. And so Alaric brings them to march on Rome. And basically the idea is, we are going to take what we are owed. It's not, you know, let's go invade Rome because that would be fun, or because we just like to arbitrarily steal stuff. Their idea is that this is, we were promised, you know, there's money in Rome, there's stuff, there's riches there, and the leadership is generally not out for the loot. The leadership is generally out for promotion. And that, when we finally get down to Odoacer, who's the one who finishes the whole deal off, he is very clear that he was promised a position in the Senate, in the government, and he keeps the rug keeps getting yanked out from under him because he's not a born Roman, and he is going to, you know, settle that issue. That's why he's going to come with his troops. Anna, was that a question?
Yeah, good.
No, okay, all right. Okay. So when Alaric comes in 410, like I said, that's a real shock to the system of the Roman culture, that you know, now we have to defend Rome itself, that barbarians can come into this city and destroy our stuff. That was just unthinkable in a certain way, and suddenly it becomes thinkable. So what they do is they bribe the Visigoths, and the Goths are the northern people, the Visigoths are the Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths are the Eastern Goths. So you can kind of hear east in Ostro and west in Visit. Yes, Kat. You're right. So it's the Visigoths who come in 410, and the Roman administration says, listen, have we got a deal for you? You know, we will throw you out of Rome eventually. You know, it may take us a while, but this will not stand. You're not going to stay here. You know, it's like people chaining themselves to the gates at the courthouse. You know, you may accomplish something for a day or two, but you know, eventually you're going to be out of there. But you want territory, right? And you want to be in charge, right? Okay, good. We have a real problem over there in Spain, where we had once conquered the area, but we're having trouble keeping it. So if you can go and take it back, which you seem to be pretty good at this military stuff, you can have that. So why don't you go take over Spain, and we will agree with that. We will support that. We will not challenge that. We will say that you are representing us. You are our deputies, but you'll be in charge. And it works. So the Visigoths and Alaric go marching off to Spain, and they take over Spain, and they are there until basically after the Muslim occupation ends, and the Roman Catholic Church at that point, but that's like 1,000 years later, takes over. And those Visigoths also are Arians. So that's another reason why Rome wants rid of them, because they don't want to have to deal with them theologically. So they send them over to Spain and they get rid of them. But that only works so many times. You know, not everybody is going to be susceptible to that kind of bribe, and not all of the groups that invade are going to be organized enough that they have the leadership that can make that deal and then make it stick, you know, and get everybody to go off with them to do Spain. So there's another major sack in 455 of the Vandals, and that's where we get the whole word vandalism, is that they come in. And again, they're mad because they feel like they've been betrayed. They feel like they've been jerked around by the Romans. And so it's yes, it's pure destructiveness, but it's born of frustration that has a real basis. And then finally, another 20 years later, you get Odoacer. And Odoacer is, again, he's come up through the Roman military system. He's a really talented general. He's even recognized by the Roman authorities that he has consolidated a lot of these pagan mercenary troops, and he is a force to be reckoned with. So they keep saying, okay, yeah, go fight this one more battle and then come to Rome and we'll give you a really juicy position of power. And they do that one too many times. And he finally says, you know what? I don't believe you anymore. I am going to bring my troops to Rome and we're just going to take over. And he does that. And what he does is he deposes the emperor. Now, the emperor at that particular moment, and this is probably not an accident. I mean, I think Odoacer knows this as he's going to Rome. The emperor at that moment is theoretically a hereditary successor who's only about 13 or something like that. I mean, it's a kid, basically. And in fact, Odoacer is so impressed and charmed by this kid that he doesn't kill him. What he does is he takes the imperial insignia, and there's a lot of historical debate about what this exactly is. Probably wasn't a crown per se, but there was a scepter and a spear, and you know, there's a collection of maybe some sort of badge or jewel or something. But anyway, an orb. There's this collection of objects that represents the imperial power. And there's one set in the West and one set in the East. So Odoacer says, okay, kid, I'm going to send you back to live with your family and you're fine, but give me the royal insignia. So he takes all this stuff and he doesn't appropriate it. This is the most brilliant piece of statesmanship, I think, that happens in this whole era. He takes it and he sends it to the emperor in the East. He sends it to Constantinople and he says, here, we're not going to be two different empires anymore. you take this stuff, you be the emperor, but I'm going to run things in Rome for now. I am now in charge of the Western half of this arrangement, but I'm not going to call myself the emperor. I'm not going to set myself up as competition to you. And he buys himself like 10 or 15 years of being able to consolidate his power without any challenge from the East, because he has said, I'm not going to be a challenge to the authority in the East. I'm just here. You have all this. I don't need this stuff. You take it and be happy and leave me alone. And so by doing that, he also removes the allure. He removes the motivation of anyone to try and get rid of him on the Western side, because it's gone. The imperial regalia, the imperial identity is not available anymore. It's what you'd be getting if you got Odoaker out would no longer be the role that it once was. And he's smart enough that he doesn't care, but he realizes that this is going to be, just a millstone around his neck as he tries to make something sensible out of the remnant of the Western Empire. And so he just gets rid of it, which I think is brilliant.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of how political Rome becomes no longer a force to be reckoned with, and how we begin to get the second wave of Christian evangelism that is going not to Roman heathenism, but into Germanic and British paganism. And that is going to be a different encounter than it was with Roman civilization. Does that make sense? Yes, Jim.
Who were the Vandals? Were they like a subset of the Goths, the Visigoths?
Yeah, they're another tribe, another northern tribe.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of them. There's the Alans, and they were in Spain for a while, and there's and it's really hard to sort them out. And if you had said to one of them, "Oh, are you a Visigoth?" they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Those are identifications that later historians will, pin on them. Basically, they were basically followers of whoever was in charge of their community at that time. But it wasn't. Most of them did not have well-articulated political structures, and so that was part of what they saw in Rome that made it attractive. That it seemed less chaotic from the outside anyway, than their little small community forever having to defend itself and be raided and be, always in contest with some other little tribe. And they saw Rome as having solved that question, and it was sort of like, how can we participate in that? How can we be a piece of that? But they were forever capturing each other and taking over each other's territories. So to say, is this person a Visigoth or a Vandal? Or, it was perhaps not a very meaningful question, except as we look back on it and say, okay, these people came across, and then those people came across, and what were they looking for? So, but you can find histories of each of these groups too, that tell you a little more about how they were connected to each other and where their original territories were. And it's, I find it challenging to understand Eastern European borders and cultures and histories today.
Right.
And this is all of that plus names that you don't even recognize. It's a pretty complex set of interrelationships. And everything was in flux at that moment. Yeah, Sarah.
I remember studying about 325, the Council of Nicaea,
Right.
and St. Augustine, and
Uh-huh.
the belief in the Trinity.
Right.
So this really didn't influence what was going on with all these other people.
Well, it will. The ongoing competition between the Trinitarians and the Arians
Right.
is going to come back up.
Oh,
But right now, what's important is that Constantine obviously came down on the side of the Council of Nicaea because it was his
Right.
council.
what's his?
And those bishops came down with the Trinity. They're the ones that said, God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are all the same thing. But that was Rome, and that was the authorities. And there were an awful lot of people teaching, especially in those eastern areas like Antioch and to the north and Turkey and places like that, who said, we don't care what the council says. We think that's a crazy idea. And that in fact, Constantine's son, Constantius, and Valens will both be Arians. They will be non-Trinitarians.
Okay.
So it's not until more or less after the fall that Rome coalesces around the Trinitarian idea. And then there'll be a lot of angst about trying to get rid of the Arians that have infested the mission to the heathens at that point.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
If you only had a limited amount of language along those frontier tribes like the Goths and the Vandals and stuff, how do you keep track of in history the relative amount of mixture of the Arians and the itinerant preachers versus the pagan religion, the relative back and flow and penetration of it all?
Right.
How do you figure that out?
Well, I mean, how does anyone ever know who's a Christian? I mean, basically, it's a matter of self-identification, right? Or in some cases, political. I mean, Rome started this, right? Rome is like, are you a Christian or not, right? Because that's going to decide whether you have to pay a fine or we feed you to the lions, or and it became a point of pride with the Christians to be willing to say, I am a Christian, even if you don't like it, right? And so if you remember that after the letters, after you have the Gospels and the epistles of Paul, you have that scriptural literature. Then you have a whole century basically of correspondence. That's what the church literature was. It was churches writing to each other. All right. And in that time you start to get, and then later in the 3rd century, end of the 3rd century, early 4th century, you start to get the martyrdoms. You start to get the stories of the saints who are going to be suffer and be killed because they are Christians. All right. Why are we writing those? Well, we're writing them to reinforce and encourage new Christians who are now being created, to want to say, to want to identify, to want to acknowledge, volunteer, I am a Christian. That's an identity statement that they want to hang on to. and it might even be, and I've never thought about this before, but as being able to say, I am a Roman citizen becomes less of an important claim, it may be that saying I'm a Christian becomes more important as a source of identity. But what's going to happen is among these, in this mission to the Germanic and British pagans, being willing to say I'm a Christian, even if that's an unpopular statement, is again, it's going to become a point of honor and pride and identity, because people have suffered, to make that claim. And maybe I'm going to suffer if I make that claim, but I want to, that's who I am. So there's that force in the direction of differentiation. I'm a Christian and you're not. That's part of how we know who we are, right? At the same time, look where they're building the churches. They're building the Christian churches on the sacred pagan sites. If there's a sacred well of Bridget, or there's a, whatever, wherever spiritual force is thought to be in the pagan world, the Christians are going to come along and build a church there, or establish a monastery there, to kind of take on the mantle of that, and also to replace the pagan interpretation with the Christian interpretation. So there is no question that there's some cross-fertilization, that there's some some saints who are going to be identified, who will take the place of the goddesses and the gods of the pagan tradition. Santa Lucia is a great example of that. Coming from Italy, from what I think is probably a pagan goddess in that culture, and then gets transferred up to the north. But the idea of the goddess with the sun and the cats and the ship and all of that stuff is pagan trimmings that get co-opted into a Christian mythology, shall we say. So there is clearly mixing. There's clearly blending between the two traditions as well. But there's also competition between those two ways of understanding the world. And the Christians, once again, the pagans don't care as much, but the Christians are really picky about who is and who isn't, and so they're gonna want to know, and they're gonna define various ways of figuring it. Not only that, before too long, they're going to want to know whether you're a Trinitarian Christian or an Arian Christian. That's going to become a big dividing line as well. Nothing's ever simple, right? It's always both and.
Yeah, I lived in 30 years in New Orleans, and there was a world of difference between the Vietnamese Catholic Church, the Central American attendees, that the saints all look like Mayans, and
Right.
the German and the French, and there you were a Catholic, but you were a Catholic. They had one corner there that had 4 different Catholic churches on each corner, and it was a famous thing they wrote down that, whatever your ethnic background, you went to this Catholic
Right.
church.
You bet. That's right. My favorite example of that is that there are people of Spanish descent, particularly women, who have a special holiday for Saint Esther. Now, there is no Saint Esther. What that is the hidden Jew celebrating Purim. but it got translated into Catholicism, and eventually, you know, originally by people who knew what they were doing, but eventually by people who had no idea what the background of that was. But yeah, exactly. So a lot of it's cultural and gets integrated in the way that culture makes sense of it. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. And
Thank you,
Sarah,
Ken.
Thank
you're
you.
welcome.